words of wisdom with my colleagues. These words of wisdom come from 13 former top civilian and military leaders. I'm going to start with the list of 8 former defense secretaries. Dr. Ashton Carter, recently deceased. William Cohen, also a former senator. Dr. Mark Esper, Dr. Robert Gates, Charles Hagel, also a former senator. General James Mattis, besides being Secretary of Defense. Leon Panetta, also a former congressman. Dr. William Perry, and also added to this list 5 former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Martin Dempsey, General Jovis Dunford Jr., Admiral Michael Mullen, General Richard Myers, and General Peter Pace. They offer some very sage advice for improving civil-military relations. And everybody knows where this principle came from, of civil control of our military. It happened December 1783 when General George Washington surrendered his papers to the Continental Congress and gave up being commander-in-chief at that particular time. These words of wisdom appear in an open letter that was published the 6th of September in the National Security blog, and that blog is entitled, quote unquote, War on the Rocks. I intended to speak about this letter at the time that I first read it, but due to our extended recess, I'm just now getting to it, about 2 months late. These former leaders warn us about what they call extreme strain in civil-military relations coming from all directions. And these are the directions that this strain is coming from, affecting civil-military relations. The pandemic was social disruption, wars that ended with unachieved goals, humanitarian withdrawal from Afghanistan, rising great power rivalries, extremely adverse political environment caused by the divisiveness of polarization in our American society, evidence here in the Congress of the United States. And lastly, contested elections and the shaky transfer of power. After listing these points, these defense leaders then predict rising tensions. Now, this is a red flag that we all ought to observe. Civil-military relations are out of balance. Though alarming, the open letter is both educational and reassuring. It offers guidance and remedies. 16 what they call core principles and best practices are spotlighted for restoring, quote, healthy American civil-military relations, end of quote. Most of these remedies hinge on the all-important principle of civilian control of the military. By the way, I spoke on that very subject from a different angle on July 14th of this year. The letter that I'm referring to views civilian control as I do. Quote, the bedrock foundation of American democracy, end of quote. It is ultimately, quote, wielded by the will of the American people as expressed through elections, end of quote. That core constitutional principle keeps our powerful standing military from threatening democracy. Healthy civilian military relations, those 4 words are in quote. Healthy civil military relations are instrumental to civilian control. They must rest on rock-solid foundation of mutual trust. Mutual trust and respect between civilian and military leaders are essential for healthy civil-military relations. They are fostered in part by honest deliberations over policy choices. According to this open letter, mutual trust is cultivated when civilian leaders, quote, rigorously explore alternatives that are best for the country regardless of the implications for partisan politics, end of quote. A dynamic and iterative process for policy development helps, quote, civil-military teams build up a reservoir of trust, end of quote. That extra measure of trust will diffuse friction when the military must, quote, faithfully implement directives that run counter to their professional military preference, end of quote. When tensions rise over disagreement with the Commander-in-Chief's policy choices, the former Pentagon leaders offer this guidance in their very own words, and this is a fairly long quote. Quote, elected and appointed civilians have the right to be wrong, meaning they have the right to insist on policies or directions that prove in hindsight to have been a mistake. This right obtains even if other voices warn in advance that the proposed actions is a mistake. Military officials are required to carry out legal orders, the wisdom of which they doubt. Civilian officials should provide the military ample opportunity to express their doubts in appropriate venues. Members of the military accept limits on the public expression of their private views, limits that would be unconstitutional if imposed on other citizens. Civilian and military officials should also take care to properly characterize military advice in public. Civilian leaders must take responsibility for the consequences of the actions that they direct, end of quote. Now, the advice of these former chiefs of staff and former secretaries of defense is honest, it's direct, and squares very much with the Constitution of the United States. The Commander-in-Chief's orders must be obeyed. The military must refrain from criticizing the President in public, and the President is accountable for policy choices. On partisan political activity, the former chiefs and secretaries of defense offer a straightforward piece of advice. Quote, there are significant limits on the public role of military personnel in partisan politics, as outlined in the long-standing Defense Department policies and regulations. Military and civilian leaders must be diligent about keeping military separate from partisan activities. The final best practice that they offer us covers the responsibility of military leaders during the transfer of power after presidential elections. They, meaning the military, have a dual obligation. First, they must assist the incumbent commander-in-chief, quote, in the exercise of his or her constitutional duty, end of quote. And second, since the voters choose the new commander-in-chief, they must prepare to assist whomever the voters pick. They carry out their responsibilities regardless of who sits in the White House. To summarize, this open letter provides sound advice that could help to moderate civil-military strife. It telegraphs a message to the top brass. It's time to hit the reset button and rebalance civil-military relations. Now, I don't know the motive behind this letter because there wasn't any indication of it, but some of it may be pointed directly at Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley. My advice to him, take their sage advice to heart. A dose of humility burnishes one's integrity. As the nation's most senior military officer, General Milley has a responsibility to set an example of excellence and cease all partisan political activity. Partisan political activity is harmful to civil-military relations and has the potential for creating dangerous divisions within the ranks of the armed forces. Military personnel must stay out of politics. Period. End of story. I yield.